Good evening and welcome as the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation about the Capitol insurrection and the threat of domestic terrorism with Mary McCord, the former acting Attorney General of the United States. Hi, I'm Felicia Chapman, the Senior International Education Manager of the World Affairs Council, and together with the Council's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. As always, we invite you to join us for all of our upcoming programs, including the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, Antoine Schillinger of Koch Project Solutions, and I know you won't want to miss the program on April 28th with Borj Brinde, the President of the World Economic Forum. Also, don't forget to register for our summer programs. We will host middle school and high school students for the Global Scholars Academy. Sessions will be held virtually and in person. Also, our Global Affairs and U.S. Foreign Policy Institute for Adult Learners is accepting applications now. We hope you can join the fun this upcoming summer. You can register for all these programs on our website at wachhouston.org. Plus, don't forget to cheer on our local area academic World Quest teams, Episcopal High School, Dulles High School, and the Post Oak School as they compete with 100 other teams from across the nation to be titled the National Academic World Quest Champions. Good luck to the teams who compete on this Saturday. We're so excited and proud of you. Now, to open our program and introduce our guest speaker tonight, representing the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, it's my pleasure to present Ken Tubman. Ken Tubman spent his career in the oil and gas industry, mostly in the technology area. He currently consults on technology and digitalization and works with a number of startup companies. Everyone, please welcome Ken Tubman.
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Mary McCord. Mary McCord is Executive Director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, where she leads a team that brings constitutional impact litigation at all levels of the federal and state courts across a wide variety of areas, including First Amendment rights, immigration, criminal justice reform, and combating the rise of private paramilitaries. McCord was the acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division from 2014 to 2016. Previously, she was an Assistant U.S. Attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Among other positions, McCord served as Deputy Chief in the Appellate Division and Chief of the Criminal Division. She has written about domestic terrorism, unlawful militia activity, and the rule of law for publications including the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic. McCord has appeared on NPR, PBS, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, and other media outlets. Please join me in welcoming Mary McCord.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Felicia, for the great introduction, and Ken Tubman for introducing our esteemed speaker for this evening, and for all your great support of the council over the many years. And Mary, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. Just to give you, I know you're very busy and very high demand. We actually were trying to do this event, I think, in February, but I suppose a sign that we're getting some good people. You were part of a House task force on security for the U.S. Capitol. So thank you very much for making the time to join us here today. And it might seem like an obvious issue, but I think terrorism is something that we all think we have an idea of, or a definition, at least in our own heads, at least, the basic idea that's the use or threat of force, maybe to achieve a political or social or ideological result. But can you talk about specifically how U.S. law defines terrorism and how you and the Justice Department and all of your colleagues defined it and prosecuted it, and maybe more importantly for today's discussion, the difference between what we consider foreign terrorism or foreign terrorist organization and domestic terrorism?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you to the council. And it sounds like you've got an incredible lineup of speakers. I'm going to have to look for opportunities to tune in going forward. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. So terrorism is defined in the United States Code, the criminal code, the same, almost identically, whether it's international or domestic, but for one difference. So whether it's international or domestic, terrorism is defined under 18 United States Code section 2331 as a crime of violence that is a crime under state or federal law that is done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or to influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, or to affect government conduct through mass destruction, assassinations, or kidnapping. So we're talking here about things that the key here is intimidation or coercion. It's not just like a one-on-one crime. I don't like you, I'm going to commit some crime against you. It's to send a bigger message of intimidation or coercion, which is usually why it is ideologically based. So the difference in our federal law between international and domestic is that when it is when it involves something that is tied to international activity, and what that really means is tied to a foreign terrorist organization, or tied to some conduct taking place overseas, then it is considered international terrorism, even if it takes place right here in the United States. So for example, a domestic terror attack like the shootings in San Bernardino, California, a few years ago that were done by two individuals who had pledged bayat to the leader of ISIS, which at the time, that was considered international terrorism, even though it took place right here in the United States, because that was done in furtherance of the goals of a designated foreign terrorist organization. By contrast, the shooting in El Paso just not too long ago was not tied to a foreign terrorist organization. So that is considered domestic terrorism. Both occurred domestically, but one had ties internationally, the other did not. If the El Paso shooter had pledged bayat to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or to any other foreign terrorist organization before committing his shooting, he would be charged with multiple crimes of terrorism. But right now in our US code, even though we have over 50 crimes that are designated as terrorism crimes, none of them apply to the most common type of terrorism in the US, which is a mass shooting. They also don't apply to car rammings unless that mass shooting or that car ramming is done on behalf or in furtherance of the goals of a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., or is actually directed at US government officials. Otherwise, it's a crime, no question about it. The El Paso shooter is charged with multiple crimes that carry the ultimate penalties, but it's not designated under our laws as a crime of terrorism.
And I suppose just for everyone to understand, you did a great job explaining the difference. If a potential threat is not seen to be connected to a foreign terrorist organization, obviously, it's paramount above and beyond anything for First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms and the right for free speech and freedom to assemble to be protected. But what does that mean for the realities on the ground for people like the FBI and law enforcement organizations trying to investigate a potential threat? And then for people like yourselves, a federal prosecutor who's trying to prosecute someone who's been charged somebody with a crime, what statutes and laws are they actually able to pursue?
Sure. So first of all, I should start with, I referenced foreign terrorist organizations, right? So the criteria for designating a foreign terrorist organization under our law is 1, that it be foreign, 2, that it commit acts of terrorism or have the capability and intent to commit acts of terrorism, and 3, that it's a threat to US nationals or US national security. Now that means that groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, with ideologies, Islamist extremist ideologies, can be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, or I'll probably say FTO during this presentation, even though some of their speech, if they were here in the US, would be protected First Amendment speech. Now, violence, acts of violence, threats to do violence, incitement to imminent violence, that's not protected First Amendment speech, but the rhetoric or the propaganda might be. In the US, we do not designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations, even if they commit acts of terrorism or have the capability an intent to, and even if they are a threat to U.S. nationals, primarily one, because there is no statutory scheme for doing so. There's no authority anywhere under law to do so. But more importantly, I think more significantly, it would probably result in almost an immediate challenge on First Amendment grounds, because an organization here that espouses an ideology, even if some of its members might engage in violence in furtherance of that ideology, violent extremism, chances are the whole organization wouldn't. Chances are that's not the only thing it espouses. And so it would have First Amendment rights. We don't worry about the First Amendment rights of foreign organizations because they're foreign. And under our law, it applies here in the US. Now, having said all of that, if you had a domestic organization here that really said, look, we exist for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to commit crimes of violence in order to intimidate or coerce. And they did so, maybe you could actually designate that organization, assuming there was a statutory regime for it, without running afoul of First Amendment rights. There are very few organizations that would be so direct as that, and they could get around it very easily. So what does this mean for investigators and for prosecutors? It doesn't mean you can't investigate domestic extremism that is where there's a violent element. It doesn't mean you can't prosecute crimes. It does mean, sorry, that's my dog shaking in the back if you all heard her. Hopefully she won't bark. So it does mean, though, you have to be a little bit more creative in terms of what types of investigations you are opening. So, for example, we know right now the FBI director has said that they have some 1,000 investigations into domestic extremist violence. The FBI cannot open an investigation into a person or a group based solely on First Amendment protected activity. So you can be talking about really awful, abhorrent things that the majority of the population would find hateful and offensive and mean. But if it's First Amendment protected and that's all you have, the FBI can't open an investigation. If a person starts talking about obtaining weapons or precursors for building an incendiary device or using any type of violence, then that would be grounds to open an investigation. You might not be able to call it a predicated investigation based on a terrorism offense, because again, there's no domestic terrorism offense that applies to mass shootings, but there would be a crime that is being planned that you can open that investigation on. With foreign terrorist organizations, it's a little different, because once somebody is starting to communicate with maybe a member of ISIS, for example, or starting to talk about travel or anything like that, that would not be protected because of that link to the foreign terrorist organization. So, there has been a lot of talk over the last several years about whether that gap in our laws should be filled. And I think it's important to recognize the gap. There are other statutes, like I said, the El Paso shooter, he's being prosecuted under state law for 22, I think maybe at this point now 23 murders, as well as other injuries. He's being prosecuted under federal law for hate crimes. So it's not like when you have a completed crime, there won't be crimes that can be charged and penalties that can be imposed. But in the investigatory stage, the prevention stage, a lot of our counterterrorism program in the US when it comes to international terrorism has been about prevention. Let's use proactive measures, undercover operations, sting operations, engaging online with people in forums who are talking about extremist violence, that then allows for an arrest to be made before a person actually commits a crime of extremist violence, based on that planning, based on taking the initial steps to commit that crime. That can be a little bit harder to do without filling that gap. Not impossible, but a little bit harder to do.
And I mostly want to turn to kind of recent events and outlook going forward. But I think just for people to get an idea of the scale and really the legacy of the threat, sadly, domestic terrorism is something that's been with us for decades. Maybe in the 1990s, especially, probably for a lot of Americans, you have something like the Unabomber, you have the Atlantic Olympic bombings, and most horrifically, the Oklahoma City bombing. 168 people killed in 1995, and 19 of those were children. I think 3 were pregnant women. Can you just briefly talk about, I suppose, domestic terrorism and the I suppose the roles of investigative agencies like the FBI and others, and also the prosecutorial side of it in the 1990s, and perhaps maybe understandably what the impact was of 9/11, perhaps taking a bit of that focus off of that when understandably, Al-Qaeda and other FTOs became a big focus.
Yeah. And, I think you're right. I mean, we've had domestic terrorist violence in this country really since its founding. If you really think back about racial lynchings and racial terrorism, I mean, that was terrorism. That was to intimidate or coerce. And we have rarely put that label on it. But I think that there are a lot of people doing some deep thinking right now, and rightfully so, about our history of terrorism in this country. But to come to the 1990s, you're very right. I mean, there were dramatic examples of terrorist attacks. I will note, however, that even some of those, particularly the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, I think we're only recently sort of starting to appreciate in its full light. I think a lot of people think of that as a attack committed by someone who was very, very anti-government. And it's true that Timothy McVeigh was very anti-government, but he was also very much espoused white supremacist extremism. I mean, he read the Turner Diaries, which is a very, I hate to use the word famous, maybe infamous novel about, accelerationist white supremacist violence leading to civil war. And that is something that he espoused. He grew up among unlawful militia extremists in Michigan, trained in paramilitary tactics, and carried out this attack. And yes, he was anti-government, but he also was a racist. And so I think it has, I think, taken us some time to sort of appreciate some of these deep underlying ideological extremist viewpoints that undergird some of the terrorist violence that we've seen in the U.S. and change the way we think about them and talk about them. But you're right, the FBI was very, very active, of course, as it should have been, in investigating not only the Oklahoma City bombing, which many of your listeners and viewers probably recognized was actually headed at the time by now the Attorney General Merrick Garland, who was not, of course, the Attorney General at the time. He was a high-level Justice Department prosecutor, and he was in charge of that investigation and those prosecutions. But there was a lot of emphasis put on that movement because it was dangerous, and that still remains the largest domestic terror attack in the US. And I use air quotes because, as we've discussed, there's other attacks. 9/11 obviously was an attack in the US, but it was considered international terrorism. So Oklahoma City, with 165 people killed, is still the biggest and most lethal domestic terror attack. 9/11 happened, and that, I mean, I'm sure everyone listening tonight, recalls very vividly how that changed our world forever. Changed the U.S. for sure, but it really changed the world forever. And that changed, I think, rightly so. The focus just was shifted toward Al-Qaeda and international terrorism. In fact, I can remember I was a prosecutor at the time doing federal bank robbery investigations, and we lost almost all of our federal bank robbery squad at the FBI because they all shifted over to counterterrorism operations. And that's how so much of the reaction in the immediate post 9/11 world was that. And that really did last for several years. That is what created the National Security Division within the Department of Justice. That's what created the Department of Homeland Security. Major changes in the way the government approached the terrorism threat were a result of 9/11 and a result of the 9/11 Commission and its recommendations. That's also resulted in taking down the wall between intelligence collection and law enforcement use of investigatory tools. It used to be that things that were collected by our foreign partners' intelligence services, our own intelligence services, using overseas authorities we have for overseas surveillance, which are different than the authorities that apply to criminal cases, where Fourth Amendment rights are very core to all of our domestic intelligence collection. There used to be this wall so that intelligence really couldn't be shared with the law enforcement side of the house. And one of the things that 9/11 taught us is we need to be sharing information because, you know, the right hand needs to know what the left hand is doing. And so that wall came down, meaning there could be sharing of intelligence, but it also meant that if law enforcement is going to use it, or if prosecutors are going to use it to bring criminal cases, they have to be respecting the Fourth Amendment rights of the people who are being prosecuted, which means letting them know that part of the evidence we have against you came from these foreign intelligence collection surveillance authorities that are based on different things than our standard probable cause. But I'm probably getting more in the weeds than people here.
No, it's very interesting.
Yeah. So as we come forward, you know, so much focus on international terrorism, and then as that threat, the Al-Qaeda threat, you know, seemed to wane, and it's never gone away, and it still exists. So it's just, you know, for those who don't hear about it in the news every day, believe me, there's plenty of Al-Qaeda still around, and they're just, you know, in different places, and they're not as open and obvious as they had been for a while. And there were efforts put toward the domestic extremist threat, but I don't think after 9/11 they were ever as robust as those put toward the international extremist threat. And then, of course, in 2014, June of 2014, that is when the Islamic State declared a caliphate. That was the summer of horrendous beheadings online and, you know, kidnappings and terrorist attacks in Syria and Iraq, but then also in Western Europe and in Southeast Asia and in Australia and ultimately in the United States. And so again, our counterterrorism apparatus mobilized through its resources to ISIS. That declaration occurred 1 month after I moved from being the criminal chief of the U.S. Attorney's Office in DC, doing all kinds of criminal investigations, over to the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. So, you know, in living color, went through the operational pace increasing dramatically 2014, 2015 to combat the ISIS threat. So I think, you know, because of these, you know, dramatic, and what was so different about that from Al-Qaeda, right, is the use of social media to propagandize, to recruit, to plan and plot. And so it just made it easier for ISIS to expand and to attract adherents from other countries. The foreign terrorist fighter problem, not only from the US, but from Western Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, was so much more massive than it had been in the days of Al-Qaeda. So for all kinds of legitimate reasons, there was lots and lots of focus put on that threat, and the domestic threat was not getting the same attention, even though within the US, we still were at a time when putting 9/11 aside, there were more deaths from domestic attacks, domestic ideologically motivated attacks, than from foreign terrorist organization motivated attacks. And that has maintained for some years. And certainly today, that is definitely the case. So the department has shifted, the FBI has shifted. You know, a few years ago, they rarely called anything domestic terrorism. They didn't even call the Dylan Roofs attack, massacre of 9 people in Charleston at a church, didn't even call that domestic terrorism. Prosecutors were loath to call things domestic terrorism, in part because they weren't going to be able to charge somebody with a terrorism offense, and they were worried about prejudice at trial and having the defendant say, I can't get a fair trial because the prosecutor called me a terrorist and I'm not even being charged with a terrorist crime. So a lot of things kind of, I think, combined to this reluctance to call things terrorism. But importantly, we seem to be past that now. The FBI is very clear that domestic terrorism, domestic extremist violence is the greatest terrorist threat in the homeland. Racially motivated violence is the greatest threat within that category, and white racially motivated violence is the greatest threat within racially motivated violence. DOJ is also using that terminology even in cases where it can't actually charge a terrorist crime. You know, if cases involve weapons of mass destruction, biological devices, radiological, nuclear devices, attacks on mass transit, they can charge a terrorist crime. But if it's a mass shooting, they don't have that option.
And it's obviously, you mentioned with regards to Timothy McVeigh, the 1990s might have been one of the first times a lot of Americans became aware of this concept of militias, or at least the extent to the fact that they are a across the entire United States. There are dozens of them, with thousands of members. Can you talk briefly about militias and perhaps maybe why they're so concerning? It's not, I mean, a lone wolf is definitely a threat, but something like a militia with an organized status, a specific structure and hierarchy even of command, and with military training and weapons and often sometimes even combat experience, why they're such a threat.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that because I think we're seeing more and more and more of it. And if ever you thought, well, I don't know if that really is such a threat, we can just look at the insurrection on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. The biggest conspiracy charges coming out of that so far are against members of a organized militia that has a nationwide presence. So you're right that, militias have kind of been around in the country since the founding, unlawful private militias. But in the 1990s, we had some very famous standoffs in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and Waco, Texas, of basically anti-government militias with face-offs against the federal government. And these were over various different issues, including sort of their own concepts of sovereignty and, thinking that the government is an infringement on their civil rights and civil liberties. And these armed standoffs were, very well publicized and they were very frightening, but they didn't really affect people outside of the militia and the federal agents who were involved in those standoffs. And people were killed, but it wasn't something where there was an interface of the militias with members of the public. And even more recently, we've had similar standoffs in Bunkerville, Nevada, several years ago, and in Oregon at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, again, where anti-government private militias who believe in, they should have sovereignty and not have to answer to the federal government, they had these armed standoffs. But what's been really dramatic recently in the last several years is the more and more actual engagement between private militias and members of the public. So for example, just taking 2020, after the pandemic began and governors were issuing stay-at-home orders and shutdown orders in order to protect public safety, we saw armed private unlawful militias storming state houses in Lansing, Michigan, and Boise, Idaho, and governors' mansions in Ohio and in Kentucky and elsewhere, forcibly taking up arms to intimidate and coerce governments to change their policies. I mean, remember we talking about intimidation or coercion. They have no authority to do that. They will often say, well, we exist to be a check on the tyranny of the state. But our history doesn't support that at all. Even before the founding, well-regulated militia meant regulated by the state in defense of the government, not be your own private army to take up arms anytime you want. Then when we had the killing of George Floyd and we had racial justice demonstrations, springing up spontaneously around the country, some of which did involve acts of destruction of property and violence, we had, again, these private militias saying, we need to deploy to augment law enforcement and protect property against violent anarchists, and taking up arms, often AR-15s in full military kits, combat helmets and flak jackets and boots, etc., deploying into our streets of small towns and large towns, taking up arms against, protesters and demonstrators with sometimes tragic results, like we saw in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a militia member shot 3 people, killing 2 of them and seriously wounding another. And again, this is a group that has no authority to be organizing themselves under command and control and taking up arms either to intimidate or coerce, well, always to intimidate or coerce, really, or to supposedly protect property. We have National Guards to protect property. We have police to protect property. We have private security who are licensed and vetted to protect property. But private individuals, there's no federal or state authority for them to take up those kind of arms and engage in that. And that's really what we also saw coming into January 6th. We saw organization and coordination of some of these groups. Granted, some of the thousands of people who came to Washington on January 6th probably had no intention whatsoever of violently overthrowing Capitol Police and storming the Capitol, but there definitely were some who did have those plans. They came in full military kits. They came with the types of weapons and the types of tools that they thought that they would need to do that takeover. And they, in fact, instigated it, and then many others joined in with that. And we know that at least the biggest conspiracy case right now against members of one prominent militia that's been actually very active in Texas, I'll say, and very active there recently with their leader giving speeches down at the border in Laredo. That group actively recruits from military and from law enforcement. And a large number of veterans are part of that militia as well as others. And the reason they recruit from the military and from law enforcement is because military are trained in firearms, they're trained in assault rifles, they're trained in paramilitary tactics, they're often trained in incendiary devices, and that's the kind of training that these groups find valuable so that they can engage in the activities they engage in. And just one more thing I'll say about that, many of times they try to cloak themselves in words like patriotism. They will deny being a militia, often in capital letters, because that makes it more persuasive, and claim that they are patriots who are just supporting and defending the Constitution. But it's the Constitution as they interpret it, not as the Supreme Court has interpreted or the text of the Constitution or history. And the Supreme Court has been clear since 1886 that Second Amendment does not protect private paramilitary organizations. It has upheld an anti-militia law, which exists on the books of the state of Texas to this day and has been enforced successfully in the state of Texas back in the 1980s against a militia wing of the KKK. So there are laws against this in all 50 states. It's not protected by the Second Amendment. It's not a well-regulated, because the only well-regulated militia is one that is regulated by the government.
And as you noted, domestic terrorism or the tactics, however you want to define it, has existed since, even before the country was established. And it's come from the left and it's come from the right, in the 1960s and 70s. Obviously, some of the worst violence was committed, by the Siamese, Army or, the Weather Underground, groups like that. Yeah. More recently, how would you describe the kind of threat? Obviously, it comes from all perspectives, but perhaps now maybe has more of a right-wing lean to it. What do you attribute the kind of rise in this I suppose, vitriol and I suppose connectiveness now? Is some of it from our own politics, sadly, or is it from social media making it easier for people to communicate and coordinate with each other? How do you define the threat now?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those things. So, ideologically motivated violence is just unlawful, and terrorism regardless of the ideology, right? Islamist extremism, white supremacist extremism, animal rights extremism, straight up anarchist extremism, because when you actually use violence as a means toward an ideological end, that's not just unlawful, that's the core definition of terrorism. Having said all of that, though, the data exists to show where the real threat is when we talk about the lethality of the threat. And right now it is far right extremist violence. And that is the predominant. There are nonprofit organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and others that compile data over time. They compile the cases. You can look for yourself at the ideology, but even the FBI, as I indicated, has made clear that the greatest threat right now is from white supremacists or white racially motivated violence. Now, there's oftentimes an overlap between white racially motivated violence and anti-government violence, and that's part of, I think, the political driver of this. In the last several years, as our politics have become more polarized, and I'm sorry to say it, actually reinforced and fed on by the previous president who engaged in that type of political, not just rhetoric, but propaganda on his own social media that drove a lot of the political polarization that we see right now. It drove, first of all, it gave extremists more license to feel that their views were more mainstream because they ideologically were aligned with the person in the White House on many of their issues, those issues being anti-government, because our previous president was himself very anti-government. He talked about drain the swamp over and over. He spoke out against governors many, many times, Republicans and Democrats who were trying to do public health measures in response to the pandemic. So he was very anti-government, so that was an alignment. Also very anti-immigrant, which is a core sort of value among many of these extremist groups, also aligned with the previous president. Very pro-absolutist view of the Second Amendment, which is always core to these extremist groups, and similarly with the previous president. So because of his, veneer of credibility in the position he was in, any kind of, tweet or statement that he made that could be interpreted as support for extremism was immediately interpreted that way, was propagandized, was monetized. T-shirts, many of your viewers may recall a statement made during the first debate in the presidential, election, the very first debate, when the president called on an extremist group of really a criminal street gang of street fighters that consider themselves, white chauvinists, male chauvinists. He told them to stand back and stand by, and they had T-shirts with that logo on them. Within as soon as those could get, printed on the T-shirts, it was so quick, and they recruited based on that, and they got more members based on that. So that really allowed that, plus social media, allowed the propaganda to be so widely spread. I mean, really just within nanoseconds around not just the U.S., but the globe. And what it also did is it brought many different ideologies who might have some little differences, but had a common core under one big tent, right? So you had your QAnon conspiracy theories, believing in, the deep state running a child pedophilia ring, some crazy stuff, but that type of conspiracy theory, along with accelerationists, those who are trying to accelerate toward a civil war in this country and create a white ethno-state, in the same online space as other extremists whose views might be not as far to the conspiracy side, but just much more straight up anti-government or anti-immigrant, etc., along with the militia extremists, all kind of trafficking in the same propaganda online, and we saw them all come together on January 6th. It was a big tent, and they were all there. We had QAnon, we had accelerationists, we had street gangs, we had militia extremists, and then we had, I think, ordinary citizens coming to express their First Amendment views who got swept up in the mob and in the violence. And that's, I think, partly what makes things so dangerous right now, is because so many are able to propagate their own the rhetoric and expand it. And right now, our internet platforms, our social media platforms, have not, adjusted their algorithms to not support that. They've done some things like taking down certain content and certain groups, but their algorithms still generally work to allow people to be in silos, hearing more and more and more of the same.
And related to January 6th, as you noted, there were tens of thousands of people there on the mall, mostly just there peacefully to listen to President Trump. But there were hundreds, and perhaps 1,000. We may not know exactly how many people actually stormed the Capitol. And of those, a large number obviously probably got swept up in the fever of the moment and a kind of almost spontaneous riot. There are obviously many people who had kind of premeditated this, had planned for this. There were even 2 pipe bombs, one found outside Republican headquarters, one outside of Democratic headquarters. Over 400 people, I think, have been charged so far. How difficult will it be, do you think, for federal government to, I suppose, prove a conspiracy charge, and what is required to do that?
So, I think it's unlikely they're going to be able to have a massive conspiracy for the reasons your question just indicated, right? There were lots and lots of disparate groups that came. Now, there were massive numbers who through social media should have known, like I did, and researchers knew, that there was plotting and planning to be an attack on the Capitol. I mean, that private researchers with whom I work and others had been, kind of raising the red flags about that. So certainly people who were paying attention and actually in those types of, group chats and things like that online would be aware that there were people that had that intent. But I think it would be very hard for the government to prove a massive conspiracy, because I think it was a little bit, there wasn't the level of organization for that. In the currently indicted conspiracies that I've seen, the government is doing exactly what I and my fellow prosecutors did when we were in government, which is you are showing the linkages between the participants, not only on that day, but certainly in the planning for that day and in previous things that they maybe had done. You are showing their communications with each other. And when you have the content, that's all the better. And certainly if you read the indictment of that militia group that I mentioned, that's got over a dozen people now charged, you will see the content of their communications and their planning, including having a quick reaction force staged right outside DC with more weapons, so that if they got to the point of needing more weapons, because DC has the strictest gun laws in the country, and there is no open carrying, and there's not even concealed carry unless you have a DC concealed carry license. Your license from some other state won't work. And so even though there were still a lot of people that smuggled their firearms in, I think many knew we can't go marching down the street with our AR-15s like we do in some other states, because that will just never get us anywhere. So they had quick reaction forces in case they were successful in overthrowing the Capitol. Those people could come in with further weapons and incendiary devices. And that's the kind of thing that the government will use to prove conspiracy. And I think just based on the indictment, assuming they can prove up what's in the indictment, those are strong charges. I think it remains to be seen. What we really haven't seen so much of yet are charges against people who weren't there. And if I were still in the government, obviously my first thing I'd be looking at is everyone who was there engaging in crimes, who we can identify. Let's get those people arrested. Let's get that rounded up, and let's start expanding our investigation from there. You're going to want to talk to the people who will talk to you, and some will, there's no doubt about it. Some will end up talking to the government, providing more information. You're going to want to figure out who they were in contact with, who might not there, who might have funded their travel, who might have funded their hotel rooms, who might have provided any other support or been in on the conspiracy to overthrow the Capitol. And that could involve people, outside of those who were physically there. Just like in many conspiracy cases, whether it's about drugs or, child sexual assault or anything else, there are often people who play a role, terrorism being a clear one of these, who are not the ones on the ground getting their hands dirty. They're playing a different role. And it remains to be seen whether there will be any of those kind of cases. I'm not suggesting there will or there won't, but that is what I would be looking for if I were still prosecuting.
Thank you. Just maybe a last question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Last year in your testimony before Congress, just to paraphrase, you mentioned the difficulty with regards to stopping domestic terrorism versus, foreign terrorist organizations. That sadly, a lot of times when it comes to domestic terrorism, the FBI, others are left to investigate a terrorist act after it occurred, because it's more of a challenge to investigate people, obviously because of the First and Second Amendment rights, especially First Amendment. What is it that you would, I suppose, suggest or recommend to Congress, to President Biden? I know you were the legal advisor to the House task force on, U.S. The Capitol, security. What do you think are the most important things we should do? And maybe even what should we as individuals do?
Sure. Yeah, I do think that sometimes the First Amendment gets held up as sort of an excuse for not taking action, because as I indicated before, it's a very important right. Like it's what makes our country different than a lot of other countries. And I think we all feel like it's pretty sacred. But, law enforcement, their bar is that they can't investigate based solely on First Amendment protected activity. So once there's conversations about violence or acquiring weapons, that's no longer a barrier. And it's a bit of a cop-out if law enforcement says, well, I can't take that information from you, member of the public, for example, because that's First Amendment protected activity. Yes, of course they can. If a citizen calls up and says, I've got a group that is talking about, advocating for a white ethno-state, et cetera, they have a right to say that, but that's something law enforcement ought to be knowing about. Maybe they haven't yet acquired any weapons. Maybe they haven't yet acquired any incendiary devices, but you can keep that on your radar without necessarily opening an investigation. So, I think the studies have shown interviews with convicted terrorists and with their families, that in more than 70% of the cases, there's somebody within the circle of the person who eventually radicalizes to violence who saw it coming. Whether that's a family member or a teacher or a religious leader or a coach or what have you, somebody who saw a person on that path of radicalization of violence and too frequently didn't do anything about that. And partly I think that is because many people, if you're close to someone, even if you see them on that path, you don't want to call the FBI and have them get arrested and prosecuted. You're hoping for something else, right? So we've got to be more supportive, and Congress does, and state and local communities have got to be supportive, probably through funding for local grassroots efforts to intervene on when someone appears to be on a path of radicalization toward violence, to provide other, that usually happens because of people, whether it's to Islamist extremism or domestic extremism, it usually happens to people who are missing something in their lives. We saw that with ISIS, and I see it now when I see those who get caught up in some of the domestic extremist movements. I mean, some people I think are just racist and they're going to be white supremacists, but that's still different than saying I'm now going to commit an act of violence in furtherance of my ideological views. So I think part of it is, more focus on how do we counter that, which is a heavy lift, but it's possible to do. There should at least be some discussion about whether the gaps in our terrorism statute should be filled. It's controversial because there's such a lack of trust among many people with law enforcement, and fear that law enforcement, if giving any other tool, will go after people of color, vulnerable communities. And so it would need oversight and transparency to make sure that law enforcement is putting its resources to the real threat and not to something else based on ideology. I think considering a federal anti-militia statute, as I mentioned, all the states have some type of anti-militia or anti-paramilitary activity statute, but oftentimes there's a lack of political will at the local level for elected law enforcement officials to enforce those statutes if their communities, the people who elect them, are very pro-militia, even though militias have no constitutional support and no state authority. So that might need to be a focus at the federal level, and looking at financing. So right now, extremist groups are, they use like GoFundMe to finance themselves, but whereas obviously a foreign terrorist organization can't do that. So the private sector and platforms, I think, also need to be more vigilant and have a role to play. Social media, they've been hearing the message. They haven't done enough, but they certainly hear the message. But how about the GoFundMes of the world, right? And those types of things that should be not supporting efforts of extremist groups. So this is something, when I was in government, we used to talk about terrorism as a whole of government approach to counterterrorism. And I think that was way too narrow. It's a whole of society approach, because this cannot be a government only endeavor if we're going to, and I don't think we're ever going to defeat extremism, but we can push it back, brush it back, make it less palatable, make it, seem like the fringe that it is, as opposed to something that is more mainstream. And that really takes everyone.
Just you touched upon it before, because someone asked this question a bit earlier, but maybe just to flush it out a bit more. Chapman asks, what's the difference between insurrection and domestic terrorism? Why is the Capitol incident being called an insurrection? If it was another ethnic race or group, would have been called terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are people who are calling it terrorism, and there's no question that, based on the definition I gave at the beginning, that what was happening was intended to intimidate and coerce, but more so than that, affect the government policy and affect government conduct by intimidation or coercion. I mean, it was explicitly to prevent the joint session of Congress from, certifying the Electoral College vote. And that was the reason that January 6th was chosen, and it was the reason that they successfully delayed it for some 6 hours. Now they weren't ultimately successful. So I think it is. I think it was an act of terrorism to intimidate or coerce, and certainly the killings that occurred the intentional ones, I don't think it's inappropriate to call that terrorism, but we also have another word that also describes it because it's different than some of the other acts of terrorism we've seen. It was an insurrection, and which is an attempt to actually, prevent U.S. law from being enforced. There's other definitions, overthrow the government, but the easiest one here when we talk about sedition is another word, and seditious conspiracy, which is a criminal charge that we haven't seen brought yet, but may be brought. Certainly the facts as I see them as a member of the public seem to support that, which is this conspiracy to actually, prevent, hinder, delay U.S. law from being executed. And that was, on that day, the Constitution and state and federal law required the counting of those votes. So it wasn't just we conspired to do it and we never did it. They then did it. So I think that, there's a number of terms that apply to what happened that day. And I think, but I think it's important to recognize, given what the intent was, that I think that's why we hear the terms insurrection. And that's the term that I use a lot because it's so clear what the intent was in terms of preventing government from functioning.
Okay, and Diane asks a question. Is there a likelihood that mass shootings will be recognized as domestic terrorism? And I suppose, maybe just to build upon it, you touched upon El Paso, if it was done with a purposeful decision to kill, Latinos, obviously, or if it's something like Las Vegas, the Las Vegas shooting, we don't really know. How do you make that distinction, and will a distinction be made?
Yeah, so if we just use the definitions in the code or other definitions which are similar, which are things done, for an ideological purpose, and of course the code definition is to intimidate or coerce. Clearly that means when it's done in order to, eliminate Latinos so that we don't have an invasion, as the El Paso shooter called it, an invasion at the border, or if it's done to create a white ethno state, or it's done to overthrow the government, then we have a clear sort of intent to impose that ideology or to act out on that ideology. The problem with the, difference, I guess, between some mass shootings for which we never can determine a motive is that even though certainly that intimidated people, I mean, there was mass firepower coming out of that hotel window, but if you don't know what the ideology is, like that intimidation or coercion element gets difficult to prove, because what were you trying to coerce people to do? What were you trying to coerce the government to do? It still remains unknown. So I think that even if the Congress were to pass a terrorism statute that applies to all terrorism in the US, regardless of the ideology motivated, Islamist extremism, white supremacist extremism, animal rights extremism, what have you, when done to intimidate or coerce, even if the Congress passed a statute like that, that's not going to cover all the mass shootings in the US, because when you can't determine the ideological motive behind it, the message that you are trying to send, if you think of it that way, like what's the message you're trying to send here? If you can't really pinpoint that's still not going to fall within the terrorism definition. It's just a mass shooting. And unfortunately, we've got a lot of those. In fact, a lot of the school shootings fall into that category where it's just not clear at all what message the shooter intends to convey.
And then Ruth asks, is something you've talked about, but maybe talk a bit more. Why does it take us so long for the FBI to recognize the threat of domestic terrorism?
So, I wouldn't say that they haven't recognized the threat in the past. It just their efforts to combat it have been much quieter than their efforts to combat international extremism. And I do think it's fair to say there've been fewer resources put toward it until recently. And I do think part of that is because post 9/11, I mean, there was more open discussion of an FBI testimony about and open investigations prior to that, as we discussed earlier with Oklahoma City, Unabomber, the Olympics bombing and other cases. I think that, and there were more efforts to infiltrate into some of the organizations that were supporting extremist violence domestically in the US. And a lot of attention really did get turned to international terrorism post 9/11. I mean, the numbers, 3,000 people, two of our, tallest buildings in New York, coming crashing down. It was such an incredibly devastating thing that I think it really just sucked a lot of the air out of the room for quite a long time. But I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that, we have cultural biases in this country. And I think there's been a reluctance, not just by the FBI, but by elected officials, members of the communities. It's taken people a long time to really see domestic extremism for the threat that it is. And I think that's mostly political, because at some point that extremism starts to fall into a political camp and can get, a little bit too close sometimes to things that make people uncomfortable. And so, I think that that's also why we see in some cases law enforcement response to Black Lives Matter demonstrations very differently than response to, a bunch of white militia members storming the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan with AR-15s. I mean, the difference is pretty dramatic, and we have to recognize that there's something more to that as a country and as a society, we need to address.
Okay, and just for the sake of time, I'll just maybe do two questions, and if you could try to do them relatively quickly. Bill asks, is cyber terrorism primarily or exclusively in the international terrorism arena?
I can't totally answer that because I'm no longer in government, so I don't see everything that's happening. Definitely, we saw a lot of it, in that international arena, foreign terrorist organization oriented. But I think that we certainly see domestically terrorist use of the internet. And so it then depends on what are we calling terrorist when it's use of the internet. Is it the encouraging of insurrections and terrorist attacks? Is it the propagating of the extremism? When I was in government, we had some well-known cases, Junaid Hussain, an ISIS member who actually, paid a hacker to hack into the customer logs of a major US retailer. He then culled all the email addresses, pulled out the .gov and .mil email addresses, and made a hit list that he put out over the internet calling for people to commit violence against these people. Clear cyber terrorism, right? So there's things that are short of that are definitely happening, but those type of hit lists, we've seen that here in the US as well. And we've seen, the judge in the Roger Stone trial have, a tweet by, Roger Stone with a target over her face. So it happens domestically, it happens internationally, and the propagation of extremism and encouragement to violence on the internet is something that is very, very serious and a very serious driver of the violence that actually takes place on the ground.
All right, and great. Ray asked a great question to conclude this with. What needs to be done to make an impact on this threat, both online and social media, as well as in terms of education, kind of laws? What would you say we should do and focus upon here that you haven't talked about already?
Yeah, so, I do think that Congress is going to be looking at possible reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is basically the safe harbor immunity for social media and other internet platforms for content. If they weren't part of developing that content, they're pretty much immune from civil litigation, even if it's that content that results in acts of violence. And, we can debate the merits of reforms and the merits of that immunity, but I think that's something that we're going to see Congress taking a hard look at, and it probably does need some reforms to incentivize the companies to do more in this area. I think that, we already talked about sort of like community, getting more involved and a whole of government approach. I think that another thing we need to really think about that I didn't mention earlier is I talked about foreign terrorist organizations. Right now, there are no white supremacist organizations on the list of foreign terrorist organizations. There's something like 67 organizations on it. I could be off by one or two because sometimes they're added and sometimes they're taken off. They're almost all Islamist extremist organizations. There are a few others related to like the FARC in South America and the IRA, but no white supremacist organizations. Yet we know that some of those organizations commit acts of terrorism. They run training camps. There are threats. And so if they were designated, that would be a poison pill for the US-based organizations that, you know, train with them, support them, share resources, et cetera. And that's another tool that could be used, that has been used fairly effectively on the international side. So we need to learn from all the things. We need to learn from the effective things that don't violate civil rights and civil liberties on the international side and use those on the domestic side.
All right. Well, again, I just wanted to thank our audience, all of you for joining us, and hopefully you can join us next Thursday, April 22nd, when we're hosting, honored to host former Speaker of the House, John Boehner. And the week after that, on April 28th, we'll be hosting the current president of the World Economic Forum, Birgit Brende, talking about the World Economic Forum, the Davos Summit, which they run, and also their Great Reset, their ideas of how to get the world's economy going again. And again, Mary, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you were doing another one of these just right before this. Thank you for taking all the time with us today. And more importantly, thank you for years and years of service to the country. And you continue to serve the country even after you've left the Justice Department, and to keep pushing for important and necessary changes in our laws. And thank you for all you've done.
I appreciate that. Thank you all and have a good evening.
Great. Thank you.